These are not only tales, these are authentic interactions that have been meticulously re-examined from terrifying Reddit admissions and testimonies from survivors. 5 distinct voices, 5 remarkable journeys, all revealing what they vowed to carry with them into eternity. Odd disappearances, hallways that are dark. The sound of whispers in the waves. You're listening to Midnight Outcry, when you experience the kind of fear that makes you wonder if you'll ever board a cruise ship again. Once you hear these stories, you'll understand that the ocean never returns everything it takes. So turn down the lights, hit subscribe, ring the bell, and don't forget to leave a remark. I didn't anticipate anything remarkable when I boarded the Mariner's Crown. I've always thought of cruises as tacky, pricey buffets, karaoke evenings, and crew members, fake smiles. But I was urged to come by my sister, Amanda. She needed a diversion after a terrible split, and to be honest, I needed one too. I'm Christopher Lane, a 34-year-old Pittsburgh electrician. Nothing glitzy. Champagne and views of the beach are not as important to me as wires, breaker boxes, and late-night shifts. I gave in when Amanda waved 2 reduced tickets at me. A week away from everything, including job and the mountains of bills on my kitchen table. What might go wrong? The initial 2 days went smoothly. Too delicate. People sunning on every available space on the terrace, bingo in the mornings, and unending seafood buffets. Cruise cliches, as you could imagine. However, I became aware of her on the 3rd night. At the far end of the top promenade was a woman. Instead of wearing sundresses or Hawaiian designs like the other guests, she wore a faded blue coat similar to those seen in old photos. Her shoes appeared scuffed and out of place among the shiny sandals, and her hair was neatly put up. She was observing me. I made an effort to ignore it, but the farther I went around the ship, the more she showed up. Always staring, always motionless, always a bit out of focus. In the dining hall, first, a floor above mine, in the glass elevator, and once at 2 in the morning, standing outside the door of my cabin. I was broken by that last one. Hearing the slight scrape of shoes in the corridor, I jumped to my feet. She was there when I looked through the peephole, completely still, eyes wide, head slightly cocked. The door was not opened by me. Couldn't. I simply retreated and waited for dawn to peek through the curtains while holding my breath. I casually asked a steward the following morning if our deck was allotted to a woman wearing a blue coat. His expression changed, not much, but enough to be noticed. He looked over his list, scrubbed. Once more, I scrolled. I thanked him and laughed it off, but my stomach turned to knots. "There's no one by that description on the manifest, sir." Amanda questioned why I was pale that evening. I nearly told her. Nearly. However, I caught another glimpse of the woman when I looked over her shoulder. By the portholes at the far end of the lounge, Amanda turned too this time. "Chris," she muttered, "why is that woman grinning at you?" Amanda's statement validated my fears. She also noticed her. I hadn't mentioned the woman at all. I hadn't talked about the coat, the vintage shoes, or the odd silence. But in the lounge, Amanda whispered, "Chris, she's still staring," as she leaned across the table. My blood froze. "Don't turn around." Still, I took a chance on a look. The blue-clad woman remained motionless, her face pallid in the low light, still pushed against the porthole. Now, though, she was grinning, broad, too big. I made an effort to downplay it. Amanda shook her head and said, "She's probably just another passenger." No, something is not right. Did you notice her lips? They don't move properly. Neither of us got much sleep that night. My chest seized at each footstep outside the cabin. Around 3 in the morning, Amanda said, from her side of the adjacent cabin, through the thin wall. "Chris?" I held my breath. "She's outside my door." I padded slowly to my door and looked through the peephole. Empty. However, I heard it. A slight scraping sound, like nails running across metal, when I leaned against the door and strained to listen. Long, slow, unrelenting. I cornered that same steward the following morning. Told him straight out that we were being followed by a woman, pale-faced, blue-coated, and often showing up on our deck. He glanced around uneasily, as if he was worried about being heard. At last, he leaned in and muttered, "Some passengers. See things, sir. Better not to participate." Then he hurried out, leaving me standing there with my skin crawling. It's best not to look. That night, Amanda didn't want to leave her cabin. I didn't hold her accountable. However, I suggested that we go to the major theater, someplace open and typical. Perhaps the lights and noise would calm us down, I reasoned. For a while, it was effective. We laughed more than we should have while watching a comedy act. I even caught myself wondering if we had simply been hallucinating due to exhaustion. However, Amanda grasped my arm so forcefully that it pained in the middle of the act. I turned as she growled, "Chris, look at the back row." With her hands folded neatly in her lap and her face inclined, the woman in blue sat still. The others clapped, shifted in their seats, then laughed. She remained still, not once. She never stopped smiling. Additionally, the seat was unoccupied when the lights came up at the conclusion of the performance. I couldn't get it out of me after the show. Despite the severe wind and the sea spray that covered us both, Amanda insisted on using the outdoor promenade rather than even walking back through the main hallways. She claimed she couldn't take the chance of passing her in a hallway. Amanda abruptly stopped halfway along the promenade. She took a firm hold of my hand and gestured toward the glass doors that led back inside. We could see ourselves in the reflection, two wet, nervous people rushing down the deck. However, a third figure was carried by the mirror behind us, the blue-clad woman. She mirrored our steps exactly as she walked a few strides back. I turned around. There was nobody. The promenade was dark, damp, and deserted. The reflection was gone as I turned around. I marched down to guest services the following morning. I was looking for answers. I went into great detail about her, including her smile, hair, and coat. I insisted on knowing whether she was a traveler, possibly someone experiencing distress, or possibly mentally ill. Face tense, the clerk continued to type on his computer. My stomach dropped when he finally looked up and stated, "Sir, I can confirm there is no one matching that description registered on this sailing." When I told Amanda, she didn't even seem startled. That night was the worst, and she simply nodded and muttered, "I knew it." 3 slow knocks on my cabin door were the first thing I heard. Not a crewman's courteous tap, not Amanda's teasing knock, but in between there seemed to be strong, purposeful knocks. I went cold. A quiet voice murmured from the other side. The faint voice of a woman was nearly lost in the ship's hum. Every hair on my arms stood on end when I spoke. "Christopher." With my heart hammering in my chest, I retreated. I didn't respond. Not even a breath left my body. Then, through the other door, I heard Amanda scream. She was pushed against her peephole, white as a sheet, and I whispered, "She's looking right at me," as I hurried over and ripped it open. I glanced through the peephole and saw that she was directly outside. There she was, nearer than before. Her face is inches from the lens, her eyes wide, and her face is stretched too wide with that impossible smile. She didn't flinch, remained motionless. She simply gazed, as if she had been anticipating my arrival. Amanda was pulled away from the door by me. "Avoid staring at her," I growled. I tried to sound steady even though my voice cracked. Once more, the knocking began. Slow. Intentional. A total of 3 beats. Then there was quiet. For nearly an hour, we remained in that position, listening to every ship creak, lights on, and hearts pounding. Finally, fatigue prevailed. Wide awake but too scared to move, we snuggled up on the bed. I must have fallen asleep around 3 in the morning. The cabin seemed darker than it should have been when I opened my eyes again. The light seemed to have been smothered, even though the bulbs were still on. Amanda had left. I felt a wave of panic. I sprang to my feet and yelled her name. No response. I became aware of the moisture on the window's interior at that point. She's mine now. I rushed to the door and threw it open, finding Amanda standing in the hallway, barefoot, her eyes glassy as if she were sleepwalking. Words had formed in the hazy glass, scribbled by a finger from within, and the woman in the blue coat was a few paces behind her. She cocked her head and grinned directly at me, I swear to God. I took hold of Amanda and gave her a firm shake till her eyes came back to life. She clutched to me as she gasped, like if she had been drowning. The woman has vanished. Desperate, we returned to guest services the following morning. I insisted on talking to the captain. When I pressed harder, the clerk leaned in, his voice low, his eyes darting around as they kindly informed me that he was unavailable. "You ought to quit inquiring about her." My blood froze. "So you do know, sir." His tone was stern, but his smile came back, professional and trained. "Enjoy the remainder of your cruise." I attempted a different strategy that evening. I asked a bartender if she had ever witnessed an unwelcome passenger. Mid-pour, the woman froze. The glass shattered as her fingers shook so violently. "Don't follow her," she said, leaning near. "If she knocks again, don't respond." She left without completing my purchase. Amanda pleaded with us to stay up together and keep the lights on till dawn on our final night at sea. However, fatigue pulled us under once more around midnight. The sound of trickling water awakened me up. The door to the bathroom was open. I could see her reflection in the mirror from the crack. The blue-clad woman, standing motionless. However, nobody was in the restroom, only her reflection, observing our slumber. The following morning, we disembarked. Since then, Amanda hasn't mentioned it. I haven't either. However, occasionally I notice a flash of blue fabric when I pass a window or look into a mirror in a busy area. An inappropriate smile. And I heard it again last night, 3 gentle knocks on the door in my Boston flat. Life was meant to return to normal at home. Amanda made an effort. She preoccupied herself with her work, made up jokes during lunches with friends, and continually glanced through her phone as if nothing had happened. But at night I could see it. The way she avoided mirrors, how her eyes darted to the corners of the room, and how she startled at the slightest creak or knock. Me, I was also unable to get rid of it. The cruise didn't depart even though it concluded. It accompanied us home. It was little stuff the first week. The bathroom mirror would be fogged up when I woke up, even though there had been no shower. On the hardwood floor, I would discover damp tracks that were too small and fragile to be mine. According to Amanda, it was all in my head. But then one morning she discovered dozens of dark, fuzzy pictures in her phone's gallery. They all appeared to have been lifted from the foot of our bed while we were asleep. We didn't both take them. I awoke one night to the sound of knocking once more. 3 intentional beats. However, it wasn't at the door this time. The source was the closet. After that, Amanda wouldn't sleep in that room again. We began collapsing on the sofa. Even yet, the shadows against the walls were excessively long. When we turned away, reflections in the window remained a beat too late. Additionally, I saw Amanda's hand freeze one evening when she was in the living room doing her hair. Her face gradually lost its color. "What is it?" I inquired. She fixed her gaze on the window on the other side. She muttered, "She's standing behind me." I rushed to her and pulled her away from the window pane. There was my own pale and quivering reflection, but next to it, just over Amanda's shoulder, was a woman wearing a blue coat. I swear that when she smiled, I noticed condensation forming on the inside of the glass, as if she were breathing against it. I covered the window with a blanket. It didn't matter, though, because the blanket was nicely folded at the foot of the couch later that evening. Once more, the glass was naked. And the same line from the ship, "She's mine now," was painted across the window in hazy letters that were as obvious as day. I don't know how to fight this. She may have followed us because we spotted her when we shouldn't have, but I'm not sure if we ever left her behind. However, every night when all is quiet, I hear it once more. That methodical, steady beat. There are 3 knocks. 3 at all times. And it was Amanda who stood up to respond last night. The silence was what initially caught my attention, not the sea or the salty air. It seemed as though the ship itself was holding its breath, too profound, too absolute. I became aware that I hadn't seen another traveler in almost 10 minutes while I stood in the hallway, my footfall resonating off the metal walls. That was absurd for a ship that was transporting almost 3,000 people. I'm Rachel Whitman, a nurse from Charlotte, North Carolina, and I'm 29 years old. I didn't usually spend a lot of money on trips, but this time was different. Last year, while fishing on Lake Norman, my younger brother Michael drowned. I was hollowed out by his loss in ways I couldn't describe. A week of sea air, sunsets, and maybe even a smile or two was what the cruise was meant to be. My first step toward moving on. It might help me breathe again, they reassured me. I had high hopes for the trip, but I had no idea how quickly those hopes would be dashed. It was a huge Elysian star. On the first day, everything appeared to be as usual as it could be. Packed swimming pools, lively bars, and servers with trays that gleamed in the warm light. However, little fissures started to appear by that first night. There was a misalignment of the corridors. Every time I went from deck 7 to deck 9, it felt a little different. The stairwell curved too sharply at moments and extended at others. I told myself it was seasickness or exhaustion, but when I got back to my cabin, the number on the door plate seemed to be choosing between 715 and 713 before settling back. The next day, the uneasiness increased. After breakfast, I strolled around in search of the promenade deck, but the hallway took me to a long, narrow passageway with exposed, rusty pipes above. It contrasted with the remainder of the ship's clean, contemporary finish. I was slammed like a wall by the scent of oil and brine. Before I saw Deck 0 engraved into the steel bulkhead, I convinced myself I had gone in the wrong direction. Do not remain. The letters appeared jagged and scrawled in a hurry, almost desperate. My heart pounded in my throat. A voice sounded faintly behind me before I could bend closer. "Miss Whitman?" I whirled. "You shouldn't be down here." At the far end, a uniformed crewman stood with his cap over his face. There was something off about him. His stance was too rigid, his smile too broad. "I lost my way," I stumbled. His grin persisted. "It occurs. However, passengers are not allowed on Deck 0. In order to be safe." I looked back at the bulkhead. The engraved words had vanished. There was only smooth steel left. The crew member was already leaving when I turned around again, his shoes making a faint clanging sound against the metal, although it wasn't in time with his movements. As if replayed, each echo lags. I made an effort to ignore it that evening. I sat on my cabin bed and looked through my phone's pictures. However, my screen froze on a picture I hadn't taken of a long, empty hallway with me standing at the far end. My eyes were sunken and my hair was twisted, as if I had been lost for days. Breathing heavily, I dropped the phone onto the bed and tried to tell myself it was a corrupted file. However, the ship wasn't done with me yet. That night, I was unable to sleep. The ship's buzz changed each time I closed my eyes, sounding like a bass note that was too low to be a machine. As a nurse, I had learned to trust my intuition. If something didn't feel right, it usually did. I stopped sleeping about 2 in the morning. I decided to take a stroll down the promenade deck after putting on my sweater and grabbing my phone for light. I thought, fresh air. Perhaps the stars and the fresh air would soothe me. It was darker than normal in the hallway outside my cabin. Long shadows stretched against the steel walls as the overhead lights flickered erratically. My footsteps sounded oddly like they were being followed more slowly by someone else. I paused. The reverberations ceased. My chest constricted. I froze when I turned the corner leading to the stairway. The stairs extended considerably deeper than any cruise ship should permit, extending impossibly below. The steps shone as though they had recently been cleaned, or as though seawater had trickled down from above. With the scent of salt, a light mist arose. Something inside me urged, "Look closer," despite my instincts telling me to back off. With my phone flashlight shaking in my hand, I took 3 steps down. A brass sign that read, "Passenger Manifest, updated daily," hung crookedly on the wall on the landing below. However, when I shined the light across it, I noticed just one name, Rachel Whitman, written in uneven handwriting and repeated repeatedly. With my heart in my throat, I stumbled back. The flashlight was flickering, and my phone was buzzing in my hand. Deck 0 awaits was written on the screen by an unidentified number. Do not resist. The light above me went out, leaving the stairs almost completely dark. With my chest heaving as if I had run miles, I clambered back up and slammed the cabin door behind me. I thought about requesting to disembark at the next port for the first time since on board. However, the schedule indicated that there would be no stops for 3 more days. It's been 3 days. I made myself act normal the following morning. I went to the main dining hall for breakfast, passengers conversing, coffee steam rising, and clinking silverware filled the space. I felt a wave of relief until I realized something was wrong halfway through my lunch. At my table, everyone ate in perfect unison. They seemed to be following a ballet as they raised their forks, chewed their bites, and tilted their cups in unison. My skin pricked. "Miss, are you okay?" The woman on the other side of me questioned in a tone that was too even and serene. I forced a smile and lied, saying yes. Her eyes, however, did not blink. Not one of them did. The whole table froze in mid-stride. Cups hung, forks hovered. All eyes were fixed on me. With a muttered excuse, I pushed my chair back and walked away. As soon as I entered the hallway, the cacophony of voices behind me returned to normal, as like nothing had occurred. The fog moved in around the end of the afternoon. The scene outside the windows became a changing, infinite white as it sucked up the water. "Strange," the passengers remarked. Even the crew appeared uneasy. However, I saw something that they didn't. My palm touched the glass, but the fog pressed back. Not a trick of light, not condensation. Before disappearing into the mist, a faint fingerprint that resembled mine was moist and icy. I took a picture with my phone. Another malfunction in the screen caused me to see a blurry reflection of my face instead of the fog. I had dark holes for eyes. I had my mouth stitched shut. The PA system crackled overhead at that moment. "Passengers, pay attention," the captain's voice said upbeatly. "Dinner will be served promptly at 7 o'clock. Please keep in mind." However, beneath his layered and twisted words, a second voice whispered right into my ear. "Rachel?" Deck 0. I dropped my phone tonight. Once more, the dining hall was lively, with footfall echoing and laughing resurfacing. It didn't feel real, though. It was all a lie. I became acutely aware that I was no longer merely aboard a cruise ship. I was wanted by the living Elysian star. Whether I liked it or not, dinner arrived. As if fighting the storm hammering against the hull, the chandeliers in the dining hall moved slightly with the ship's motion, their golden light too warm and constant. I sat by myself at the room's edge, looking around for anything out of the ordinary. Silverware clinked and laughter echoed, but I was unnerved. I noticed the staff halfway through the dinner. Waiters typically walked quickly, grinned, and balanced trays with ease. They shuffled rigidly tonight, doing the same things, laying plates, pouring wine, and setting glasses in precisely the same pace. When I realized they were mirrors, I tracked 3 of them simultaneously. I moved my plate aside as my flesh pricked. I became aware of the mirror at the far end of the hallway at that point. It wasn't supposed to be there. The night before, I had eaten in this room, which had an ocean mural but no mirror. Now, however, the entire hall was reflected in a huge, elaborate frame. Or it ought to have, anyway. I saw that the reflection wasn't correct when I squinted. Everyone was facing me in the mirror. Even those with their backs to me in real life were waiting, their reflections looking directly ahead. With my heart racing, I ran away and knocked over a chair in the process. Nobody trailed behind. Nobody seemed to notice at all. For a moment, I saw myself standing among the throng of travelers, my eyes hollow and my face expressionless, while the mirror flickered like a TV screen losing service. Seeking answers, or at least the appearance of authority, I searched for the purser's desk. However, the desk was vacant and the computer screen with the login page was dimly lit. A staff-only door stood open behind it. I paused. My instinct was to go, but I was drawn ahead by curiosity, which was always the quality that misled me. The staff hallway was a small space with faint lighting from fluorescent lights that buzzed. Overhead, pipes clattered. The air had a subtle brine-tinged metallic odor, I went past a door that said, Medical Bay, another that said, Crew Manifest, and then one that made me stop cold, Deck Zero Access. The handle felt chilly to the touch, as though it led outside. I heard what I thought was flowing water when I pushed my ear on it. Not like the water outside, not like waves. It was within. From the opposite side, something crashed into the door. Once, twice, the frame trembled. I covered my mouth to prevent myself from yelling as I stumbled back. Then there was quiet. Once more, my phone buzzed in my pocket. One fresh message. Why not? I took off running. I was shaking so much by the time I got to my cabin that I could hardly get the keycard into the lock. I felt a wave of relief when the door snapped open. My bed, my bag, and the walls all appeared to be familiar once more. However, there was a leather-bound book on the desk that I had never seen before. The pages were fresh and clean, but the cover was damp and soaked. My hands were shaking when I opened it. The penmanship was neat and filled each page. My handwriting. Everything I had just experienced was detailed in the notes, including the message from Deck Zero, the dining hall mirror, and the crew's mirrored actions. Everything. The last paragraph, Rachel Whitman enters Deck Zero tonight, however, really got me cold. She doesn't come back. The lights wavered. You've already written this. If you're listening to this, please take a moment to subscribe to Midnight Outcry. It helps save stories like this. A draft glided across the floor, bearing the faintest whisper. I threw the book on the floor, slammed it shut, and climbed into bed. But there was no sleep. I could see the stairs going on forever, with my name on each step every time I blinked. Peace was why I had boarded the Elysian Star. For therapeutic purposes. For quiet. I had discovered something else instead. I wasn't going to any ports or islands with the ship. It made me reflect about myself. Deeper. In the direction of Deck Zero. Furthermore, I was unsure of how long I could ignore the call. I didn't get any sleep that evening. Not at all. I swore that every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the mattress moving under me, as if there were insects crawling inside the bed frame. Around daybreak, the walls moaned softly, and I felt my body wobble, as though the ship was circling something deeper rather than riding waves. The numbers were incorrect when I eventually had the courage to check the clock. Not damaged, simply incorrect. 00. The digital screen blinked. Again and again. The numbers would not alter no matter how many times I whacked it. Desperate for human interaction and someone to wake me from whatever nightmare this was, I stumbled out into the hallway. The walls hummed softly with the engine's pulse, and the carpet muffled my footsteps in the quiet hallway. I heard someone crying a few doors down. Not crying, not crying. It was only a constant, quiet whimper, like a dog abandoned in the cold. I leaned toward cabin 223, the door from which it originated. When the sobbing ceased, my hand was hovering just above the handle. The doorknob then turned on its own. Before it opened, I ran back to my cabin. In the afternoon, I attempted to convince myself that tension was making shadows appear deeper than they actually were, and that I was simply unsettled. In one of the lounges, I even made myself play a trivia game. Vacationers gathered around tiny tables, grinning when asked about state capitals and classic TV series. But I was distracted. Not until I noticed that the hostess hadn't blinked since I had taken a seat. She never looked at her cards, reading each question with a fixed smile, her pupils blown, her eyes wide, as if she already knew the answers. I froze as she called my name to ask the next question. Her voice snapped into the microphone as she said, Rachel Whitman. The Elysian Star sank in which year? The audience chuckled uneasily, thinking it was a joke, but she fixed me with her gaze. I felt sick to my stomach. The ship was still afloat. Not quite yet. I murmured something, pushed my chair back and walked away. Long after I entered the hallway, I could still hear the hostess laughing behind me. I made another attempt to ignore the book that evening. After shoveling it into the drawer and slamming it shut, I switched off the light. However, It was open on my chest when I woke up in the middle of the night. It was a new page. The ink remained damp. My walk to cabin 223 was detailed. The game of trivia. Even the query from the hostess. I dropped the book as if it had burnt me as I saw the words. Tonight, Rachel descends, beneath it. However, my hand was already on its way to the door. I promised myself not to open it. Whatever was pulling me, I assured myself, I was stronger. Even yet, I felt as though I was sleepwalking with my eyes wide open as my legs took me down the hallway, my feet bare against the carpet. The only sound coming from the ship was the distant hiss of rushing water. It originated in the staff hallway, by way of the door marked Deck 0. I arrived there, but I can't recall how I got there. It wasn't locked this time. The handle was slippery and dripping wet. With heavy breath, I opened it and gazed down the stairway. It didn't appear to be man-made. The walls had a dark sheen, were curved, and were narrow. The steps continued to descend, disappearing beneath sloshy dark water with every ship roll. My phone buzzed, and I saw the words, "Welcome back, Rachel," engraved deep into the metal right above the first step on the wall. I looked, even though I didn't want to. The stairs breathed as a fresh message appeared on the screen. "You've been here before." It did, I promise. The gloom below gave way to warm, humid air that smelled of rust, brine, and something sour, like rotting kelp that had been exposed to the sun for too long. The metal was slippery, throbbing slightly as if it had a heartbeat, and my bare foot almost slid when it hit the first step. I held onto the rail, but it was no longer made of cold steel. It was supple, warm, as though I were grasping muscle rather than metal. My fingers dug in. All of my instincts told me to stop, to sprint, must act as though none of this was true. The whispers, however, resumed. This time, I wasn't thinking about them. Thousands of voices came up from below, piled like a flood, drawing me in. "Watch. Go down. Come back." I staggered down, knees shaking, heart pounding. Every step reverberated, but it wasn't coming from my feet, rather it was coming from behind me, as though someone was mimicking me a beat late. The stairs led to a gigantic chamber by the time I got to the bottom. I went cold. It wasn't a deck for maintenance. There was nothing human about it. Slick with wetness, the walls stretched into unfathomable curves. The platform I was standing on had black water lapped at its borders. Chains hung from the ceiling and disappeared into the sea, and a huge book in the middle of it all. Its leather surface was bloated and slippery, shimmering dimly with bioluminescent veins, and it was larger than any table I had ever seen. Each turn of the pages splattered water droplets throughout the chamber as they flapped in an imaginary wind. I was itching to run, to let out a cry, to reject it. But I was betrayed by my body. I moved slowly in the direction of the book. The water pooled underneath it, swirled in my reflection, but it wasn't me. It was an older myself, with sunken lips, empty eyes, and things I couldn't hear spoken. Once more, my phone buzzed. I raised it against my will. A fresh message appeared on the screen with an unknown sender. "Sign your name." The murmurs grew louder and pressed closer to my head. Sign. Remain. Witness. When the pages of the book ceased to flutter, my knees gave way. On a blank sheet, they froze. Just inches from my palm, a pen made of pouring seawater erupted from the surface. I knew that I would never leave if I touched it. Still, I could hear footsteps approaching from behind. Footsteps dragging, wet. I had seconds. Less, perhaps. I had to decide between seeing what was coming up those stairs and signing. The sound of dragging footsteps increased. Uneven, wet, and metallic. The platform shook with each stride, the chains creaking overhead. I gripped the rail of the enormous book's pedestal, caught between a sick, nagging curiosity and fear. I let out weak gasps of breath. Then I noticed it. From the stairwell came something. His eyes bulged as though they had been pushed into sockets they weren't supposed to be in, and his skin clung too tightly to his skull, giving the impression that he was a man at first. His mouth widened, grinning too broadly and excessively. It gushed water incessantly, splattering all over the floor. His uniform was also incorrect. R's name tag shone like new brass on a drenched and rotting steward's jacket. Holloway. I gave a sharp blink. I felt sick to my stomach. My name was that. His voice distorted like an underwater intercom. He croaked, "Rachel!" "It's written already." He raised his hand. A pen, the same one that was hovering over the book, dangled in it. Like a storm tide, the murmurs surrounding me rose. "Sign. Observe." I shook my head angrily, my eyes burning with tears. "Stay." No, I'm not," before the book itself moaned and began to buckle its pages. Once more, my phone buzzed and flashed the message. "You've already signed." The steward, or whatever was in his shape, stepped forward, creating puddles that steamed against the metal floor. "You just don't remember yet." His body did not match his shadow. It was longer, elongated, and had several outstretched arms. I retreated till my back was against the enormous book. Its cover's veins pulsed, now flashing a pale red. Behind me, like a house-sized lung, I could feel it breathing. I muttered, "Please," to everything and no one. The steward's smile widened as he tilted his head. "You're not a visitor." The pen hovering above the book crushed into my hand as I screamed, "You're a page." Chilly. Damp. Alive. My own fingers wrapped tightly around it before I could drop it or refuse. "Right," the murmur said, drowning out everything else. The pen sank into my flesh, the cold metal nearly merging with my bones. My hand moved by itself, dragging across the live book's thick parchment. The ink was thick, metallic, and warm. It wasn't even ink, glistening in the dim lantern light, blood red. Rachel Holloway. Despite my best efforts to resist and keep my wrist from slipping, the letters splayed across the page in my own handwriting. There was a finality to each letter that sent tremors through the room. The steward's jaw cracked as his smile grew wider. Water still gushing down his throat, he rasped, "There." The walls trembled as they said, "You belong." Chains moaned. The ship's horn blared somewhere above, but it wasn't a horn at all. Rather, it was a chorus of cries. Hundreds of voices blended into a single, never-ending pitch. As if the ship itself had eaten, the pedestal sank a little, pulled downward by the weight of my name. The pen was still soldered to my palm as I stumbled backward, clutching my chest. The steward took a step forward. His body shifted and twisted, appearing as a twisted, boneless silhouette, or as a wet uniform. "You'll find out soon. There is no recording in the book. It produces. The next chapter is you." "No." My voice broke. I turned and ran for the stairway, slipping on the collecting water, saying, "I'm not staying here." I was pursued by the book's murmurs, which blended into a loud chorus. "Observe. Note. Never leave." The stairwell seemed to go on forever, but this time, I felt a burning sensation inside of me that was more intense than fear. Fury. Feeling the pen throb against my flesh, I tightened my grip and threw it down the endless metal steps. Like a gunshot, the sound reverberated. The whispers faltered instantly. The steward appeared to have lost his anchor as his body trembled, flickering and glitching. The sound of his scream broke into static. As if in protest, the book shouted as its pages flailed fiercely. I was thrown against the wall when the floor shifted. Above, a hatch blew open, letting in moonlight. A wind blew down the stairway, cold and salty. Legs scorching, ribs hurting, every breath a battle, I clawed my way up. The steward shouted behind me, "No page escapes! No chapter is finished!" I dragged myself through to the hatch. The sudden light made my eyes sting. I was on the outside promenade, deck 11. Waves crashed far below. Stars gleamed above. For a split second, it was genuine. Typical. However, the ship was not finished. In front of me, the railing twisted, the metal curving into my name's letters. The deck became longer and wider, changing shape as if to sustain my sprinting indefinitely. In the distance, passengers emerged, motionless, grinning, silently toasting with their glasses. Trembling, I dropped to my knees and gazed up into the limitless night sky. I felt my chest heave. Perhaps there was no way out. This might have been written before. With a smooth, serene, and ageless voice, the captain made a last remark over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us aboard the Ocean Reverie. We are pleased to welcome Rachel Holloway as our newest passenger tonight. She'll watch, she'll stay." The lights on the deck went down. One by one, the stars above faded away, leaving behind nothing but the black ocean, boundless and ravenous. No one ever leaves the ship, I realized, as the whispers grew louder once more, filling every void inside my mind. All we do is become stories. My name is still being written by the ship. Have you ever heard of somebody booking a cruise by themselves? It's mostly harmless. Widows and widowers attempting to heal, retirees taking care of themselves, and singles looking to socialize. However, I swear I witnessed something that still doesn't make sense on the Miami cruise I took last summer. I can't shake it, but I also can't convince myself it's genuine. It began immediately after we departed port on the first night. I, David Carver, a 34-year-old Ohio history teacher, was traveling alone. After a difficult split, I thought I would need the ocean air, delicious food, and possibly some time away from my troubles, so I booked the cruise. On the third deck was my cabin, a little internal space that was essentially a bed, a desk, and a bathroom. Nothing extravagant. 329 was the number of the cabin across the hall, and I could tell something wasn't right as soon as I passed it. When I got there with my suitcase, the door was open. The lights were low inside, and a man sat still on the bed. His hands were folded in his lap, and he was dressed in a vintage gray suit reminiscent of one from the 1940s. Without moving or blinking, he simply gazed at the wall. I nodded and mumbled, hey," as I groped for my keycard. No answer, not even a glimmer of recognition. I reasoned that he might simply be sleepy, strange, or non-English speaking. But as I closed my own door, I couldn't get the image out of my mind. The rigid shoulders, the odd old clothes, the way he appeared to be almost positioned there. Later that evening, I inquired about the man in 329 from my steward, Marco, a happy Filipino man. 329, after repeating, he looked at his chart. He scowled before tapping the paper. "No, sir. This trip, cabin 329, is unassigned. No passenger." I chuckled uneasily, assuming he must be wrong. Marco, however, shook his head. "Not at all. Locked." There was no one inside, but when I opened my door the following morning, I noticed that the door to cabin 329 was once more cracked open. The man was still seated, too. In the same place. In the hallway, I froze. He was still standing there, looking at the distant wall as though the outer world didn't exist, in the same gray suit. The cabin light was faint, and his knuckles were pallid against the neatly clenched hands. I tried to shake the jitters by clearing my throat. "Good morning." Nothing. He didn't even blink his eyes. A pair was joking over breakfast as they passed me on their way to the stairs. They both didn't look inside the room, not even a double take, I mean. As though they were completely unaware of him. The back of my neck began to prickle at that moment. I closed my door and put my ear to it. Quiet. Just the continuous heartbeat-like hum of the engines. I tried to ignore it at breakfast. Perhaps I was too exhausted. Marco might have been wrong. However, the uneasiness accompanied me everywhere, including the packed buffet, the pool deck, and even the corny comedy show that night. Later that evening, I went back to my cabin and found the corridor deserted. This time, the door to cabin 329 was closed. In relief, I let out a breath until I saw something that made my stomach turn. A folded piece of paper was slipped halfway under my cabin door. I lifted it up with hands that were shaking. The penmanship was crisp, almost artistic, but the paper had yellowed and the ink had faded. Avoid staring at him for too long. My heart stopped, I swear. The more you notice, the more he notices you. I glanced at the paper's number. 329 was scribbled softly in darker ink in the corner. I didn't get any sleep that evening. I believed I heard slow, dragging footsteps in the corridor every time I closed my eyes, and they stopped right outside my door. And once, deep in the night, I heard a cabin door open with a gentle click. Not his. The following morning, I was plagued by the paper. To remind myself it was real, I kept it folded in my pocket and touched it with my fingertips every few minutes. That it wasn't a dream. The door was locked when I went by 329 on my way to breakfast. Not a sound. Not a trace of life. Nevertheless, the image of that man standing still, like a mannequin left in the incorrect spot, would not leave me. I leaned in Marco's direction over burnt coffee and fried eggs. "Hey, who's in 329? Marco scowled. "No one. It's secured. Upkeep or something." I chuckled uneasily. "Really? No. I caught a glimpse of him last evening." Marco's smile wavered as he stood there in a gray suit and white shirt. He put down his fork. "David, don't make fun of that." "What?" He lowered his voice and looked around. "What do they say about that cabin?" "You know what they say?" He paused as if he were going to reveal something to me that he would later come to regret. He shook his head after that. "Ignore it. I could see it in his face, but it's dumb." It wasn't foolish. Not to him. By nightfall, I summoned the courage to hang out in front of 329. I acted as though I was checking my phone, but I was just waiting and not scrolling. Every sound was muffled by the carpet in the quiet hallway. Then I heard it, as faint as a sigh. A slight scratch, similar to shoes scuffing the floorboards. The 329 doorknob turned, slowly. My pulse was pounding as I staggered back. The door opened an inch with a squeak, 2 inches. Inside, it was dark. Then, an eye, icy, unyielding, and as pale as glass, peering through the crevice at me. I swear I was having trouble breathing. My phone clattered on the carpet after slipping out of my hand. The door was closed when I looked up again. I hardly slept that night when a voice, so faint I nearly thought I was dreaming, came from inside. "I see you too." I could always see that pale eye in the door's crack when I closed my eyes. It didn't blink. It didn't recoil. It simply examined me. I determined I needed answers by morning. I walked up to a steward at the dining hall and said, "Hey, what's up with cabin 329? Is there a maintenance problem?" The man's face went cold. He was briefly a man taken by surprise rather than a steward. Then, like a mask, his smile returned. "Sir, cabin 329 is empty. Enjoy your breakfast, please." He hurried off, his shoulders rigid. I didn't understand it wasn't just me until then. The crew was aware. I went by 329 once more later that afternoon. A few paces ahead of me stood a family of 4, the mother holding a young boy's hand and the father carrying a toddler. The lad abruptly jerked free as they passed the cottage, coming to a complete stop in front of the door. He pointed and muttered, "Daddy." The father froze, saying, "That man is watching us." His wife shook her head angrily and pulled at his arm. They didn't look at the door at all. Rather, he quickly left without saying anything after grabbing the youngster. I felt nauseous. I couldn't help myself that evening. Around midnight, I sneaked back to 329, recording on my phone. There was silence in the hallway. Too quiet. I held up my phone. "All right," I muttered to myself. "Do something if you're real." Nothing for a moment. Then, the handle of the door clicked. "Slowly," I gasped. The man in the gray suit emerged when the door opened wider this time. He went outside. It dawned on me then that he was not walking. He had no movement at all. Like a shadow peeling from the wall, his figure simply moved forward, sleek and mechanical. I took a step back, my hand shaking as I recorded the entire thing. "Who are you?" I stumbled. His neck cracked like dried wood as his head tipped. His eyes were excessively wide. His lips were thin. His skin was pallid. "You looked first," he remarked in a voice that wasn't quite his own. "You stay then." I ran away, heart thumping in my throat. I ran down the hallway. My phone was still gripped tightly in my fingers when I finally stopped, breathing. The screen had turned black. Nothing was there when I listened to the recording again. Static only, inquiring, "Who are you?" And then a pause. No distorted speech, no sliding figure. The evidence seemed to have been destroyed by the ship itself. I persuaded myself I had dreamed it the following morning. Perhaps stress. My mind is twisted by grief. But as soon as I entered the dining hall, that thought was dashed. Talk ceased. The utensils froze in the air. All the passengers, dozens of them, turned to stare at me. Not every one of them. Only those who were sitting on the starboard side, with the windows facing the sea. They followed me, their eyes as glassy and blank, like the man in cabin 329. I staggered back with a rattling tray. "Don't look back," a woman at the next table said, her lips hardly moving. "Keep him from knowing you're still observing," yet my instincts failed me. I pivoted. He was there, standing on the vast ocean, as though it were solid ground, through the glass, past the deck. The same gray outfit, still and dripping wet. He raised his pallid face to meet mine. He grinned as well. Every hallway felt off by that time. Halls were longer than they should have been, and cabin numbers were twisted. Brass railing reflections blinked out of time with me. Even worse, other travelers began to steer clear of me. People stopped talking when I walked up. People stood up and walked around. They appeared to be aware of what I had observed. He wasn't merely trapping me with the ship. I was becoming a carrier as a result. The intercom crackled as I lay in my cabin that night. The evening's entertainment plan was given in a joyful voice by the captain. However, behind it, like a distorted audio recording, came the same distorted murmur I had heard in the hallway. "Remain. Observe. Look at that." I slammed the phone receiver. The murmur continued. It originated within the room, out of the closet. The tiny rattle of the closet door was initially caused by something rubbing against it from within. My breath halted somewhere between my throat and lungs as I froze, covers drawn up to my chest. Slow, deliberate, another scrape. I made myself get up. As I walked across the room, my feet shook as they struck the carpet. I felt like I was stepping into my own tomb with each step. I held onto the handle. "Just clothing," I muttered. "It's just clothes," I said. But as soon as I opened the door, the air changed. It became moist and cold, conveying the ocean's saline. It was no longer my closet inside. Cabin 329 was the location. The walls were peeled down, the carpet was wet, and there was a slight mildew odor. And there he was, slumped on the chair, the gray, suit-wearing dude. He didn't move, but his head lolled up. His eyes were glassy, and water was streaming down his cheeks. "Why?" His voice was strained and cracked. "Did you abandon it without me?" My heart slammed against my ribs as I staggered back. The hinges of my closet door groaned as it opened wide. Black smoke filled the room as the shadows behind him seemed to writhe. He got up slowly, as if he were being pulled up by threads. "Stay," the shadows murmured alongside him, their voices blending in 100 different tones. "Observe, look." I was overcome by the overpowering scent of salt water. My feet became wet on the carpet. Without prompting, my phone's screen flickered as it flashed up in my grasp. A SMS message appeared with a blink. From unknown, cabin 329 is never empty. Then the ship moaned, a subtle shiver of metal that shook the desk glasses. My light went off, and all that was left in the darkness was his voice, directly behind me. "You're next." The whisper was so near to my ear that I felt my skin tingle. "You're next." I turned around, but nothing was there. Other than the open closet door, which no longer led to my closet at all, My cabin was deserted. Cabin 329 was still in use. Water trickling down his sleeves onto my carpet, the man in the gray suit stepped forward. He said, "Once you've seen it, you can't unsee it," and his lips never moved, but his words stuck in my head. "We stay on the ship. Forever." My cabin's walls started to throb, as if they were breathing. Wet, with seawater, the carpet grew darker. My bed drooped, as if it were wet. With my hand fumbling for the handle, I backed toward the door, but it remained fixed. The man in the gray suit grabbed for me, black water dripping from between his nails as his fingers grew abnormally long. In my ears, my heartbeat screamed. When instinct finally took over, I snatched up my phone charger, the only heavy object in my immediate vicinity, and threw it at him. It passed right through. The thing was swallowed entirely by the shadow behind him. Then there were whispers, perhaps hundreds of voices. "Observe, stay, belong." The closet expanded wider, the walls lengthening until the entire cabin bent toward it. Men, women, and children were all piled together, their voices indistinct except for one refrain. My things moved across the floor in the direction of that black, infinite doorway. I resisted it. I sank my fingernails into the carpet and clawed at the desk. But the suction was unrelenting, drawing me closer and closer to the man in the gray suit who was waiting for me. I let out a yell. I finally let out a scream. Then there was stillness. The tug ceased. Once again, the lights flickered on. Once more, my closet was just a closet. Empty. Dry. Typical. With my chest heaving, I fell into the bed. Was it my imagination? Again, my phone buzzed. The message, "Cabin 329 will open again," flashed. "You won't leave when it does." I made an effort to appear normal the following morning. Breakfast. Chair on the deck. Talking casually with folks who appeared to be doing just fine. However, I always thought I saw water flowing from their eyes, their sleeves, and their hair when I stared at them for too long. The number on the door had changed by the time I got back to my cabin. No longer 417. 329. I've returned to land. Perhaps someone will believe me if I write this. Everything was disputed by the cruise line. Claimed there was no such cabin. My receipts matched the 417 on my boarding pass, but what I observed is known to me. I am aware of my lodging, and occasionally at night I hear it once more. The faint murmur of voices just beyond my closet door, the quiet moan of the ocean sovereign's hull. I no longer open it, not quite yet, because I know in my heart that it will open itself one day. Cabin 329 will take me the remainder of the way when it does. You are already included in the observation if you have read this far. And so it starts. Before the ship decides you've noticed too much, sign up for Midnight Outcry if you want more real experiences like this. On the first night of the vacation, I recall being on the outer deck with the ocean extending out to all sides and having a strong feeling that something was amiss. There was a sense of weight in the air, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath, but the ship itself looked stunning, blazing with its neon lights against the black water. I'm a 34-year-old paramedic in Denver, Colorado, and my name is Michael Carter. I had taken this trip because I needed to decompress, not because I wanted a vacation. My younger brother had died in a vehicle accident 6 months prior. When he passed away, I couldn't get rid of the guilt that perhaps I could have saved him because he had been my best friend. My mother, of all people, gave me the cruise brochure and said, "Michael, go." After everyone advised me I needed a change of scenery, please. I was trying to force myself to feel alive again while on a week-long Caribbean cruise. Don't drown in this grief. I promised myself that I would take advantage of the opportunity to unwind, perhaps socialize with new people, and perhaps even recover some joy. However, I already knew in my heart that this ship would not bring me serenity. Instead, I discovered something very different. Before we even left port, the first odd event occurred. I saw a woman in front of me as I was pulling my suitcase down the long, narrow hallway leading to my cabin. She wore vintage clothing, like something from the 1950s, with her hair styled in curls and a pale blue dress with white accent. A few doors down from mine, she stood at the entrance of cabin number 412. I briefly believed that there might be a themed event taking place. However, the way she gazed at me was what stopped me cold. Not merely a quick look. Sharp and unblinking, her eyes met mine as though she had been anticipating my arrival. The corridor was deserted as she opened the cabin door and slid inside. To find out why her gaze had shaken me so much, I stopped at my own cabin, room 416, and stood there for a whole minute with my palm on the keycard. It was more than just her silence or her attire. She appeared too motionless, as if she were acting as though she were still alive. I tried to shake it off inside my cabin. I went to dinner, unpacked, and even spoke with several of my fellow travelers. With children playing, couples sipping cocktails, and seniors sharing their travelogues, the ship was a hive of activity. Everything appeared to be typical, but I couldn't get the picture of the woman in the light blue outfit out of my head. Around 2 a.m. that night, I heard a knock on my cabin door. The knock wasn't gentle. It was slow and methodical. There are 3 knocks. Hold on, 3 more. With a pounding heart, I froze in bed. At that hour, no one would be there. I remained still for a long time. I then upped the last of my confidence, slipped to the door, and looked through the peephole. There was nobody in the hallway. However, I caught the smallest hint of movement as I stood there, holding my breath. I saw her again along the corridor, close to cabin 412. Standing with her back to me was the woman wearing the blue dress. She didn't move at all this time. I blinked, and she was gone in an instant. I made an effort to convince myself that it was simply fatigue, jet lag, or perhaps even grief. In actuality, though, I realized I wasn't alone in the hallway after that. And it wasn't just another traveler who had its sights set on me. Half thinking I had imagined the entire incident, I dragged myself to breakfast the morning following that odd knocking. There were many people at the buffet, sunlight streaming in through the large windows, children laughing and splattering orange juice, and elderly couples reading newspapers in peace. I should have been comforted by the normalcy. However, it didn't. I looked at every face I saw, trying to find her, the one in the blue dress. She wasn't present. Not a sign of her, and for a while, I allowed myself to think that perhaps she was a figment of my grieving mind. Then I heard something that made me shiver. At the next table, 2 women were conversing. "Did you hear about the woman last night?" one muttered, leaning closer to the other. Cabin 412. Someone claimed to have seen her pacing the hallways once more. That word became ingrained in my mind. "I apologize, did you say cabin 412? I inquired nonchalantly as I bent down. They gave me the courteous suspicion that strangers save for inquisitive neighbors. At last, one of them replied, "Yes. It's only a narrative the staff tells, so don't worry. Years ago, a passenger reportedly passed away in that room. She's still seen, people say." As though it were innocuous, she laughed. The lady in blue. But I felt sick to my stomach. I'd seen her. I stayed out of my hallway as much as possible that night, drinking whiskey and listening to a lousy cover band perform 80s ballads in the ship's lounge. It should have been a soothing atmosphere, but I kept feeling like I was being watched. I half expected to see her reflection staring back every time I looked toward the mirrored walls. The corridor felt a little off when I eventually forced myself to walk back to my cabin. Too silent. As though sound itself had diminished, the ship's engines, typical low hum, looked subdued. The metal walls rang forcefully with my footsteps. I froze as I got to my door. In cabin 412, the door was ajar. There were no lights inside, and the area outside was completely dark. I didn't want to look at it. I wanted to swipe my card, lock myself in my room, and forget what I had seen, but every logical bone in my body warned me otherwise. But curiosity, foolish curiosity, pulled me in. "Hey," I muttered as I moved warily in the direction of the door. The air instantly changed. It smelled strongly of sea brine and mildew, as though the ocean itself had soaked inside, and it was colder. I leaned in a little bit. Then, motion. A figure hurried past the doorway so quickly that I nearly thought I was seeing it. A haze of light blue cloth, disappearing into the darkness. With a pounding heart, I staggered back. However, before I could flee, I noticed a piece of paper fluttering just inside the chamber. I grabbed it and slammed the door after reaching inside. With shaking hands, I unfurled the paper back in my cabin, lit by the bedside lamp. It was an ancient passenger manifest with ripped edges and a yellowed appearance. The names were typed in faded ink, but Eleanor Whitmore's name was circled in scarlet. 27 years old, died. My lips dried up when I saw the words, "She doesn't want you to leave," written underneath in handwriting that was scratched rather than typed, nearly etched into the page. I gazed at the article until I could no longer see well. How could something like this just show up in an empty cabin? It didn't make sense. I couldn't sleep that night. I sat up and stared at the door every time the ship creaked, where there was a shuffle of footsteps in the hallway. I swear I once heard someone whispering outdoors. It was more like the sound of breath passing through unformed syllables than actual words. By morning, I was worn out. I promised myself that I would speak with someone, possibly the staff. The skipper, perhaps. However, a deeper conclusion had already taken root in my chest by the time the sun rose. There was more to whatever was going on in cabin 412. It was more than just sadness or tiredness. It was authentic. And I had been observed by Eleanor Whitmore, the woman in blue. I told myself I wasn't going insane by the middle of the morning. I had evidence. The manifest document was not in my mind or in a dream. It had been something or someone who wanted me to find it. I made the decision to bring it to the front desk. If you weren't paying too much attention, the woman behind the reception desk had the kind of polished smile that could pass for real kindness. "Good morning, sir." Marissa was written on her name tag. "How may I assist you?" I moved the paper across the desk after folding it. Last night I discovered this in a cabin. Cabin 412. She stumbled over her smile. It was just lying there. Something clenched behind her eyes for a half second, as though I had spoken the one thing I shouldn't have. As she pushed the paper back, she firmly stated, "Cabin 412 isn't occupied. Maybe you're wrong." "No, I'm not wrong." I pushed the page in her direction once more. "Take a look. Eleanor Whitmore is the name." Circled. This needs to be explained by someone. Marissa hurriedly tucked the document under a clipboard after taking a brief look at it. She spoke in a softer tone. "Sir, you should avoid going to locations where you don't belong." Her wording made my skin crawl. "For your own safety." She had said it was "for your own safety," not "it's dangerous" or "don't worry about it." I leaned forward. Whatever became of her? To Eleanor. But like a mask, Marissa's smile returned with a snap. "Sir, have fun on the pool deck." She looked aside, putting the subject on hold. "Lunch is served until 2. I felt like every eye in the foyer was following me as I left, my heart pounding. I avoided my cabin as much as possible that evening. As I strolled around the upper deck, I observed the waves and the unending blackness of the ocean against the horizon. A chilly breeze that smelled of diesel and salt blew across my face. I heard footsteps behind me at that moment. I pivoted. Standing close to the railing, facing the ocean, was a woman wearing a blue dress. The breeze had raised her dark hair a little, I muttered. "Eleanor." Before I could stop myself, she turned her head, slowly, too slowly. I stumbled backward as her face appeared. Her eyes were black depths as deep as the water below, not eyes at all. Her mouth opened, but only a slight hiss like steam from a kettle came out. She vanished as soon as I blinked. The railing was all that was left. As though something had just slid beneath the surface, the sea beyond roiled wildly. With my chest heaving, I dashed back inside. The overhead lights buzzed softly, and the hallways felt more constrained than normal. I froze as I got to my cabin. Something had been slipped beneath my door. Another piece of paper was there. "She follows those who notice her," was written in the same carved script as the previous one. "You can't get support from the personnel. Do not approach the water." I held it with trembling hands. These were written by whom? Is a traveler attempting to alert me? A member of the crew making a mean joke? Or Eleanor herself? I was unable to close my eyes as I lay in bed that night. Vibrating through the walls and my bones, the buzz of the engine seemed louder than before, and below that came the sound of breathing, faint but distinct. Not outdoors, but from the room's corner. Slowly, with every nerve in my body screaming, I turned. The corner chair was no longer vacant. There sat a pale figure, observing. In the darkness, her garment glistened a pale shade of blue. "You saw me," she said, tilting her head and moving her lips silently, but I could hear the whisper in my thoughts as clearly as if it had been shouted out loud. "You stay now." I was immobile. My body had gripped itself into the mattress, squeezing my throat and beating my chest as if my own terror were strangling me. There was no blinking from the guy in the chair. Didn't take a breath. Then, blink. She no longer had black gaps in her eyes. I owned them. She was staring back at me with her own brown eyes. I sprang to my feet and fumbled for the light switch. I fumbled with my fingers on the wall. The chair was vacant when the lamp flared on. The fabric just had a slight wet mark, as if something moist had been there for hours. With my heart pounding, I shoved myself against the wall. It was impossible to sleep. I remained up all night, listening to the lamp hum and the ship's creaks being amplified until I believed the walls were whispering. By dawn, I was at my breaking point. I went rushing to the lobby. That same glassy smile was back on Marissa's desk. "I demand answers," I yelled. "Eleanor Whitmore. Her name appears on the manifest. Why? She's in my cabin, but why?" This time her smile remained unwavering. It widened, if anything. I slammed my hand on the counter and said, "Sir, you really should let these things go." "No." There was a long pause until someone said, "Tell me what the hell is going on this ship," as if they hadn't heard anything. The few travelers in the lobby turned their heads elsewhere. Marissa drew in, her scent acrid and overpowering. She said, "Sir, you're attracting attention to yourself, and she wants attention." She glanced over my shoulder. I pivoted. Eleanor was standing at the far end of the lobby, water streaming across the carpet, her clothes sticking to her body, and her flesh completely soaked. Slowly, she lifted her head. Her mouth moved. "Michael, my name," as clear as day. However, nobody else in the lobby appeared to notice. I sprinted up the stairs and backed away, almost falling over my own feet. With the numerals on the doors twisted and lighting dimly as if they had just been painted, the hallways blended together. When I finally arrived to my cabin, I pushed the door shut and slumped against it, struggling to breathe. I heard it at that point. A gentle splash. I went cold. It was coming from my bathroom. One more splash. The faucet's gradual groan as it turned on by itself came next. The water trickled, then poured. With caution, I took a step forward, my entire body screaming. The bathroom door was somewhat ajar. Curling from the edges was steam. I opened it. The tub was so full that water was dripping onto the tile from the sides, and hair floated in the sea, dark, long hair that spreads like ink. A pale hand gripped the tub's edge and broke the surface. Then another. Eleanor slowly got to her feet, her face drenched, her vacant eyes seeing mine. "You saw me," she said in a gurgle, her lips dripping water. "The sea will now carry you as well." I staggered back, colliding with the wall so forcefully that I lost my breath. Water splashed over the floor as Eleanor dragged herself out of the tub, her damp hair clinging to her face. It wasn't footsteps. Rather, it sounded like something sloshing inside of her, each movement resonating like hollow cave waves. I ran. For a moment, the cabin door stuck. Was it bloated from the moisture? Then exploded. I slammed the door behind me as I dashed into the hallway. On the wet carpet, my sneakers made a squeak sound. Wet. It had never been damp. Passengers strolled down the hall, chatting and laughing. They didn't notice the sound of footsteps following me or respond to the water leaking from beneath my cabin door. Slow. Intentional. When I got to the stairwell, I almost slid down the steps head first. My chest ripped with breath. All I could think was, I need help. This must be seen by someone. There were many people in the dining hall. Families, couples, card games for retirees. Everything appeared to be typical. Too typical. I persisted until I noticed Rogers, the cruise director, making a positive speech next to the buffet. I took hold of his sleeve. Please, pay attention. A passenger is present, but she shouldn't be here. She is in my cabin. His expression froze. His smile wavered a little bit. Then he bent over the microphone. We hope that everyone is having a good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Keep in mind that during the first few nights at sea, some passengers can experience confusion. Our staff is available to help if you need it. He was staring directly at me, telling me, and nobody else gave a flinch. I felt sick to my stomach. I noticed her at that point. Standing at the rear of the room is Eleanor, wet, gazing. And she was recognized by others this time, but not in the manner I anticipated. Passengers turned their heads toward her, one by one. Then, in my direction, they seemed to have been waiting for this moment, as evidenced by their unwavering smiles and dreamy eyes. I took off running. I don't recall how I got there, but all of a sudden I found myself on deck 9, which Marissa had mentioned was forbidden. Despite being chained, the doors shook open as if they had been waiting for me. There was silence on the deck. Empty. The fog and salt were heavy in the air. Attracted by a dim glimmer at the far end, I moved onward. There was no wind, save the pages of a logbook fluttering on a seat. I leaned in. Passenger Michael Harris was the final entry. Cabin 6 to 241. Saw her. Retrievably marked. I went cold. My name. My cabin. Chains clinked behind me. Water trickled. I pivoted. Eleanor stood there grinning, her eyes sunken and her teeth too sharp. The crew members on either side of her had the same smiles and were as smooth as if the seawater was pulsing beneath them. Rogers, voice bellowed, "Welcome," but his lips remained stationary. "The vessel is fed via observation. Now you belong here." The fog rushed ahead. The deck swayed. The horizon was engulfed by the sea. Neither Rogers nor Eleanor's voices were the last I heard. I owned it. Whispering, "You ought not to have glanced at her." A week later, the Ocean Sovereign docked. Families got off the ship. Chatter, laughter, and relief. It was reported that cabin 6 to 241 was unoccupied. Only damp linens, an unmade bed, and a slight ocean odor. However, I was still included in the manifest. Michael Harris, traveler on board. And underneath it, "Do not open the door after midnight," written in thin, bleeding ink. Up until the first night at sea, I didn't think that ominous omens were real. My cabin door was knocked on 3 times. Not raucous, not desperate, simply be steady. Deliberate. I stared at the handle as I froze. Nestled close to the stern on deck 4, my cabin was tiny. Almost no one went by this corridor. I hadn't even finished unpacking and hadn't spoken to anyone since boarding. But the knocks continued. I'm Daniel Carter, a 34-year-old Ohio paramedic. After a terrible winter and a succession of heartbreak, I booked this cruise aboard the Elysian Star, seized the doorknob, and yanked the door open. There was nobody in the hallway. Overhead, fluorescent lights buzzed, their radiance bouncing off the metal walls. No footsteps, not a shadow. There was only quiet, so total it seemed contrived. Leaning out, I looked in both directions. Nothing. I nearly burst out laughing. The ship might have creaked. A hoax, perhaps. After locking the door, I climbed into bed. However, I awoke to the sound once more at 3:12 a.m. Make a knocking sound. Softer this time, nearly patient. "Who's there?" With a dry throat, I called. Quiet. It was fatigue, I told myself the following morning. In an attempt to get over it, I went to the breakfast buffet. Around me, people were chatting, families were laughing, and the crew was busy. Typical. Too typical. However, there was something stuck behind the door when I got back to my cabin. A folded piece of ship stationery, the type with the top stamped with the Elysian Star logo. It said, Cabin 427, in crisp, strange calligraphy. Midnight, don't come alone. I took a deep breath. I was in cabin 426. There was no 427. They went from 426 to 428 in the numbering. When I first checked in, I had noticed it, but didn't give it much thought. Ship layouts were peculiar. It felt purposeful now, though. I kept feeling like I was being watched all day. I noticed a man in a dark coat looking up at me from the bottom deck of the atrium. He was gone as I blinked. A young child pointed to me at the pool and murmured something to her mother, who shushed her right away. By nightfall, I was a nervous wreck. I kept repeating the note over and over in my head. Don't arrive by yourself. Midnight arrived sooner than I had hoped. With the lights turned down to night mode, the corridor outside my cabin was silent. I quickly glanced at the space between 426 and 428. Just a piece of blank wall. However, the air felt heavier and colder there. Then I heard it. Make a knocking sound. From within the wall. I touched the metal to my ear. My stomach became icy. Somebody, was inside. With my heart racing, I took a step back and muttered, "What do you want?" A pause. "Let me in," I said faintly through the wall, and I staggered back, almost tripping over my own shoes. My feet wouldn't move, despite my every instinct telling me to run. The voice had been fractured and quiet, like someone talking through water rather than loud. I struggled with the keycard as I retreated toward my cabin. It took 3 tries until the green light blinked because my hands were shaking so much. After sneaking inside, I shut the door and slammed it. I stood in the dark for a long time, listening with my chest heaving. Nothing. Don't knock. Don't whisper. However, I froze when I at last had the courage to turn around. The folded stationery, the same one that was in cabin 427. Midnight. Lying on my pillow was the phrase, "Don't come alone." It wasn't something I brought in. With shaking hands, I snatched it up and looked at the back. This time, the same immaculate handwriting was used to scribble 3 new words. "We see you." That night, I hardly slept. My mind continued attempting to make sense of it. Crew prank, perhaps? Am I being harassed by a sick passenger? However, the weight of that impossibility, that there was no 427, made all other explanations fall apart. I headed straight to the front desk the following morning. I asked about the cabin numbering, trying to speak steadily. The cashier gave a courteous smile. "Yes, sir, for design reasons, some of our decks have unusual numbering." "Unusual?" I pushed. Her smile hardened as she said, "You mean missing." "Is there anything more I can do to assist you?" I spoke more softly. "Who placed this beneath my door?" I moved the stationery to the other side of the counter. She looked at it, and her face faltered for a moment. As if to see if anyone was observing, her gaze darted to the side. Then, without lingering on it, she slid the note back to me. "Sir, I have no idea where you got that. Enjoy your voyage, please." It wasn't only a dismissal, it was a warning. I sensed eyes on me all day. Crew members that were too cautious. Visitors who fell hushed as I passed. When putting down my plate at lunch, a waiter leaned in and said, in a voice so soft I thought I could have dreamt it, "Don't open the door again." I had no intention of opening that door again. I made a self-promise not to. However, curiosity, which has always been both my weakness and my lone protection, continued to tug at me as the note on my pillow burned in my pocket like a brand. I promised myself that I would just enter the hallway, take a quick look, and then head straight to the bridge, the bar, or any other place where people and normal sounds were present. This ship didn't want me to view anything by myself. The fragrance of salt and floor polish filled the hallway. A fine mist, almost like breath, clung to the baseboards, and it felt cooler than the rest of the ship. In the dim light, the cabin numbers glowed: 410, 428, 430. After that, there was nothing but a seam in the wall and a blank expanse of door faces. I listened to the motors hum like a sleeping animal while I stood for a long time in front of that seam, my palms sweating. The metal was heated when I finally touched the seam. It was warmer than it ought to be. It pulsed like a heartbeat beneath my fingers. 2 doors down, there was a scraping sound. No knocks. There's something moving across the floor. I halted the scraping by holding my breath. I could hear my own blood in the ensuing silence. I spun when the voice, low and close, stated, "You're not supposed to be here." Immediately next to me, as if a whisper had materialized into a person. Nobody. However, the corridor appeared longer out of the corner of my eye, with lights that stretched into a viewpoint that wasn't appropriate for the deck. My stomach lurched as I took a step forward and felt the floor tilt slightly. I took out my phone on a whim. It was useless and had no service, but the camera was still functional. I captured the shaking vapor, the seam, and the blank stretch in place of numerals on camera. In the morning, the video would most likely get corrupted. Nevertheless, viewing the world through the tiny screen helped me to remain calm and turn this into proof rather than insanity. A cabin door stood ajar, 3 doors down. A lamp with a flickering shade and the corner of a picture of a family on a dock with their grins captured on camera were visible through the slit. The photograph glowed with a warmth that wasn't there in the rest of the deck because of the light coming from the room. I felt that awful, chilly dread tighten like a noose as I grabbed for the knob. The picture on the dresser shook like a leaf in the wind, then slipped open to expose a folded Polaroid underneath before my hand touched metal. On the back, in handwriting I didn't recognize, was my name. I don't recall entering that room. I couldn't recall taking that picture. My feet were stuck in the hallway, but my legs longed to run. Behind me, something moved. I didn't look around. I heard the gentle slip of shoes that were too familiar with the deck and the shuffling of an old coat across the carpet. Someone said, "You're seen." It wasn't upset. It was personal. I imagined the server who refused to look me in the eye and the front desk clerk's eyes darting to one side. The crew wasn't stupid. Rather, they were afraid or complicit. Perhaps both. The idea sat in the back of my throat like dust. Someone had to be keeping track of who boarded and who didn't leave, and someone had to be watching. The Polaroid was slipped into my pocket. As though the paper itself was soaked with sea cold, it became icy. I walked out of the room and silently closed the door, my hands shaking. With my knees bent and my breath coming in sharp gasps, I sank down to the carpet while pressing my back on the wood. The hallway hummed. The hum eventually became a cadence that I could associate with a heartbeat, a word, a tap, a pause, and another tap-tap. It sounded as though the ship itself was telephoning a message in Morse from somewhere below. I walked and stood. The faces in the small windows, if any, stared back at me. As I passed each doorway, their faces lacquered and blank. Every now and again, a pair of eyes would blink, as if the ship had given them permission to see. A moist, pale hand once pushed against a piece of glass, leaving a fingerprint that steamed for a moment before fading away as if it had never been there. I should have turned around when I saw a maintenance notice at the elevator bank that said, "Closed for repairs" in blocky letters, taped over with a second note in wobbly ink, "Do not descend." Someone had written, in small characters, "They count" underneath that. I should have attended the packed buffet, sat with strangers, and saw the monotonous announcements about port arrivals and the routine breakfast rush. Rather, the sighing seemed like a challenge. I pushed the elevator button and slipped the tape back. The doors opened onto a shaft that had an old diesel and damp rope odor. Inside, a separate numbering, dates instead of deck numbers, glowed on the floor panel. The numbers scrolled more slowly than they should have, and suddenly stopped on June 14, 1999, a day I was unaware of. The doors opened onto a hallway that was different from the ship I had entered when the elevator stopped again, or at least felt like it stopped. The metal walls had black, pitted rivets. The ceiling was lined with coiling pipes. The lights were dim and red, like a submarine's emergency lights. The hum of the engine seemed to contain voices since it was closer and louder. A pair of boots padded by, smearing the metal floor with wet sand. A shadow, leaning in at an odd angle, followed the boots. I took a step forward and swallowed the bile that was rising in my throat. There was a metallic taste in the air. I remembered the posted notice and the maintenance hatch I had seen earlier by the laundry. I recalled the waiter's advice, which I mentally recite like a prayer: don't open the door. At the end of the hallway was a hatch, rounded, bolted, with a salt-clouded window. I caught a glimpse of a faint figure moving through the cloud, fingertips pressed against the inner glass. It's more of a hint of someone who was not quite a person. On the hatch was a small placard that read "Crew Access," authorized only, with the phrase "authorized" crossed out, and a single word, "listed," inserted underneath. My throat constricted. Enumerated. I sensed that the ship was categorizing me and recording my observation. The smell of old rope and an unidentified sharpening agent filled the space beyond the hatch. The edges of crates, stacked like tombstones, were illuminated by my flashlight beam. Names, dates, and small indications of what might be within were written on their sides, along with stencils. Fresh condensation and a name written in large block letters were found on a container closest to the door. My name. I refrained from screaming. I lacked the energy to. All of a sudden, my limbs felt leaden and weightless, as if gravity had decided I belonged here and had tightened its hold. When I placed my palm on the crate, my flesh briefly adhered to the cold, salt-slick wood. Letters appeared in the wood beneath my thumbprint, 6 to 241, as though the ship had responded with ink. The number was like a strike to my chest. I was aware. The clerk's sidelong gaze, the raucous greeting, the bridge banner, all of it folded back to that little string of numbers somewhere in the portion of my mind that struggled to remain sane. At first, cabin numbers were just numbers, but now they were coordinates on a map that had been drawn for decades by someone else. The entire corridor jumped when there was a mechanical clatter upstairs. There was more tapping, tap, pause, tap, tap, as though whatever was counting under the hull was operating more quickly. The lights blinked in unison as the sound permeated them. As the numbers started to line up, I continued to count until I heard a pattern that sounded like a code: remain, right, belong. That words kept repeating in my mind. The bolt for the hatch then slid somewhere behind me. First, slowly, as though someone was being courteous, and then more firmly. No one had approached that I could hear. The hallway was deserted. The hatch window fogged as though breath had been expelled against it as I turned. Something in me, perhaps the last bit of rationality or survival instinct, told me to back off. The universe reshaped itself around me as I retreated one step at a time. With the Christmas music from the lounge leaking out like a falsehood, the elevator doors that had been metal closed and reopened to reveal Deck 14's bright, varnished corridor. A family carrying cones of ice cream passed by. The sun shone too brightly. Like an indictment, the heat pounded me. I fumbled in my pockets. There it was, the Polaroid, wet against my thigh. I sat on a bench in the sun and watched people move like performers in a stage direction that wasn't mine, and I noticed that the ink on the back had changed, and that another line, written in the same neat hand, read, "We're cataloging you." I wanted to shout, to tell them that my name had been inscribed on rough wood like a future they had planned for me, that the ship housed containers of people's names, and that the maintenance halls hummed with counting. Who would trust me, though? Who was in charge of removing the steel skin to make sure? However, One individual from the buffet line, a woman dressed in a passenger uniform, gave me a smile that stopped short of her eyes. After staring at me for a moment too long, she mouthed the words, "Leave," while reaching for a dish, her hands moving fluidly. "Avoid writing. Where did you leave?" I had a question. What should I leave before? However, she had left by the time I got up to pursue her outside to get answers. Despite the presence of the typical crowd of tourists and sunburned couples on the route she had been standing on, none of them appeared to notice her departure. It seemed as though the ship's program had erased her departure as a bug. For the first time, I questioned whether it was safer to remain silent as I pushed my palms to my temples. What part did I play in the ship's appetite if it thrived on attention? I recalled the waiter's whisper and the clerk's sidelong glance. In the end, they all acted in the same manner, avoiding eye contact, moving forward, and issuing warnings that were barely covered by decency. Perhaps they were cataloging me with a tenderness that made my skin crawl, or perhaps they were defending me. Regardless, night arrived. The lights on the ship became amber. Mist obscured the stars in the ocean-black, smooth sky above. It felt safer to move than to remain motionless, so I walked the deck. Now, the Polaroid in my pocket pulsed against my thigh like a burning weight. I would look down every 10 steps, hoping the number would change. My name, half of my face, and the back of a script that knew my secrets before I did were all the same. A small moonlight cruise, the late-night piano in the lounge, and safety reminders were all announced over the PA at midnight in the customary, rehearsed voice. The words were a nightmare disguised as a lullaby. Perched on a bench close to the stern, I observed the sea as though I could learn its routine motions to protect myself from the unusual. The ship moaned. In a brief staccato, the lights along the rail blinked once, then twice. Press. Hold on. Tap, tap. It was coming from beneath the deck. More than I could hear, I could feel it in my boots. Then, behind me, there was the gentle scratch of shoes on metal. I didn't look around. The way a draft runs down your neck before a window opens is how I sensed the presence. Sliding along the deck, a shadow hesitated. A figure that wasn't mine was reflected in the shiny brass of the rail. A man in a black suit, blurry at the corners. The type of figure that seemed more appropriate for vintage photos than late-night cruise decks. He was closer than he should have been. In the wake of the darkness, a voice muttered, "You shouldn't have seen the crates." It had a worn-out, predictable tone, like a fact being declared, yet it wasn't malevolent. But now you have. I wanted to rise up and declare that my name would not be listed, that no painted or wood number would be able to claim it. The bluster vanished like ashes. The ship seemed to know more about me than any person I had ever trusted, and for the first time during the entire journey, I felt as though we were conversing. I couldn't tell which voice was in my thoughts or in the air, but it said, "You can run. You have the right to yell. You can put it in writing. Or you might enter the light and be helpful." I exhaled quickly. It felt like a hot coal, the Polaroid. Horribly, I realized what it desired: witnesses. That was its currency, the recording and return of attention as something that kept the whispers talking and the hull warm. Carefully wrapped into cartons that were piled out of sight were cataloged lives. Everything is a file system for what transpired when you look too carefully, including the elevator's dates, the crew hatches, and the maintenance passageways. As though the ship had blinked, the man in the suit vanished into the water's reflection. A little ledger was open on the bench next to me where he had been. In block letters, my name. A tidy timestamp with the precise time of midnight beneath it. 3 columns, OBSERVED, written/transferred, with the first 2 boxes checked, and the third one left empty, are located beneath the timestamp. My nails ached from clenching my hands. Like something that had been waiting a long time for a new entry in its ledger, the ship breathed around me, patient and massive. Someone laughed somewhere on deck. It was a cheerful, uninformed sound made by people who were unaware that they were components of a filing system. It was obscene. With my hands freezing and the bench scratching, I got up and took the ledger. It felt like the paper was too dry to be at sea. Like an ultimatum, the empty transferred box gazed back at me. I had options, they weren't very good. I could play tourist till the ship got bored of me, go to the packed buffet in the morning, and put the ledger back. I could approach the cashier, insist on answers, and observe as her eyes darted away and her grin became even more strained. Alternatively, I may write, join the data, and alter the trajectory of the thing that ate by observing. I had my pen in my pocket. Notebooks, lists, evidence, and an old habit had all been there from the beginning. Perhaps my writing could be an offering that saved me, but the ship had thrived on my attention. It's possible that putting down my observations, feelings, and losses could be the catalyst for change. With the ledger perched on my knee, I took a seat again. The creaking of the bench was almost like a warning. I dipped the pen. Paper and ink came into contact. That blank area in the transferred column was where my hand was hovering. Would it be considered submitted if I checked it? Or finish? If I checked that box, would I be buried deeper, or would whatever the ship held inside the containers be released? The pen made contact with the paper. I felt the first letter form reluctantly, like frigid water. Then another. As dark as the river below, the ink left a stain on my fingers. The box's last stroke, a tiny pivotal square, was formed by the third mark. Press. Hold on. Tap, tap. Similar to a metronome adjusting to whatever I had just signed up for, the sound increased and then decreased. The pages of the ledger whispered softly as it closed. A person emerged from the sea on the far rail, where the deck and the ocean met. It was someone I had seen in Polaroids, in photographs, whose faces blended into the haze, and it raised a hand in a wordless, impossible salute. My chest began to constrict. The bench behind me seemed to be in a separate universe. I stood with numb hands and realized, for the first time with a frost-like clarity, what it meant to be seen and heard. I reasoned that there would be witnesses. There will be ledgers, pens, and notes. Names will be inscribed on wood and kept like cargo, and there will be voices in the hull that matter. Additionally, some people, like me, will board in the hopes of discovering a horizon only to discover that the attention apparatus wants them to be cataloged. The ledger didn't end the loop, I thought, as the ship sighed and the deck lights blinked in the same constant signal. It opened. My entry would be read by someone, somewhere. If they were interested, obstinate, or too much like me, they may trace the markings down and find themselves where I am now, sitting on a bench at midnight, studying the ledger with shaky hands. They would find my note, my name, and the number 6 to 241. With the ledger tucked under my arm like illegal contraband, I returned inside with no Polaroids in my pockets. The light in the corridor was harsher now, and the faces in the windows resembled promises rather than photos. The chain was engaged on the inside at the cabin door. When I left, I hadn't grasped it. 3 slow taps, a gentle knock. My chest constricted. Now the sound was the properats, the summons, not the call to adventure. I tucked the ledger beneath the bed. Once more, the knocks were courteous and patient. The handle turned. I briefly contemplated running into the hallway, clutching a ledger and pen, and slamming through the doors like a robber. However, I was familiar with the subsequent sound, the voices that would line up like pages, and the hum in the hull that would change into a counting beat. A man in a dark suit stood in the doorway, blurred at the edges as if he were an image capturing its last focus, and sunlight from the corridor poured in as the door slowly opened. The sunlight was not warm, but it was washed in like paper left in the rain. He took a single step forward and grinned silently. His words were, "You wrote." My throat shut. I parted my lips, then shut them again. You can say no in 100 different ways. None appeared secure. Good, he stated plainly, as though the word itself were foldable and fileable. We need good witnesses. At the far end of the corridor behind him, a faint, almost courteous clack sounded. A box ceiling, a lid closing for storage, and the wall seam trembled like a curtain. The ship let out a breath. Like a contented animal, the engines hummed. Outside, the ocean continued to flow in its usual manner. Like a sleeping cat, I sat on the bed and watched the ledger beneath the mattress. The fact that witnesses were required for the ledger was consoling. The realization that I had become one was equally terrifying. The ship came back to life the following morning. Children splashed each other as they sprinted over the pool deck. At the buffet, tourists waited in line with dishes full of bacon and pancakes. Crew members grinned, erasing all memory of what I had gone through with their well-practiced hospitality. I briefly questioned whether I had dreamed it. Perhaps fatigue, perhaps too many whiskey-fueled late nights. However, the Polaroid was still in my pocket when I grabbed for it. The ink on the back had changed once again just now. 6 to 241. Transferred. Witness complete. I felt sick to my stomach. That was not what I had written. The world around me appeared thinner, like a movie set with little too flat walls, even though I stuffed it back in my pocket. I never saw myself directly when I caught a reflection, whether it was in the elevator's mirrored wall or the shiny brass handrails. Like a poor video feed, my reflection lagged, its eyes moving a fraction of a second too late. I sat with an Ohio couple at lunch. Halfway through the lunch, the woman leaned closer and murmured, without her husband even responding, "You shouldn't have signed the ledger." Her eyes did not contact mine, but they were happy, discussing their children back home. As she ate her chicken and nodded in agreement with her husband's conversation, she continued to smile as if nothing had happened. However, the words formed again, silently, on her lips. "Don't turn around." I almost let my fork fall. Sleep wouldn't come that night. As I lay in bed, I listened to the ship's groans and creaks while gazing up at the ceiling. I must have fallen into a half-dream at one point because I woke up to the sound of scratching from beneath the bed. My blood froze. I slowly bent over, raised the edge of the blanket, and looked underneath. There was the ledger. Pages open on the floor, no longer behind the mattress. Although no hand touched the paper, it moved, the ink smearing across the surface and creating words that weren't mine. Next witness arriving, June 14th. I slammed it shut, pushed it back under the mattress, and sat up with my chest heaving. You will guide. I recognized then that this was no longer about me running away. I wasn't merely listed. They had recruited me. The Ocean Sovereign desired more than only onlookers. Keepers were what it desired. And I was now one, whether I liked it or not. I therefore experienced a change in myself when the PA announced that new passengers embarking tomorrow morning. This time it was a whisper from my own mind, not from the spacecraft. Pay close attention to them. One of them will remain. If you're reading this and have ever considered going on a cruise, proceed with caution. Observe the walls, the reflections, and the doors that don't lead to the correct places. Additionally, avoid writing on any ledgers that contain your name, because after you do, you are no longer merely a passenger, you are a member of the vessel. Forever.